Hello students. In the previous session, we have had an overview of the chapter The Portrait of a Lady, and we have also looked at the word meanings of the chapter. Today we will begin the chapter The Portrait of a Lady. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. So, at the very first, the author Khushwant Singh talks about his grandmother. He had known his grandmother for the last 20 years, and she had always been old and wrinkled, means she is an old woman with wrinkles all over her face due to old age. The author says that people used to tell him, and he used to hear, that once upon a time his grandmother was very young and pretty, and very pretty, and she also had a husband. And this was almost hard to believe for the author, as the author says this. Okay, he says this. He says that it is hard to believe. It is hard to believe that once upon a time his grandmother was young and pretty and even had a husband. So this fact was hard to believe for the author. Now, why it was hard for the author to believe that? Because he has always seen his grandmother old and with wrinkles all over her face. And that is why it was hard for him to believe that once she was young and pretty and even had a husband. And now the author says about his grandfather also. His grandfather's portrait was hung on the wall of the drawing room, and in that portrait the grandfather was wearing loose-fitted clothes, a turban, and he had white-colored beard that reached his chest. Okay, so the grandfather also looked very old, at least 100 years old. And the author says that the grandfather was someone, or the grandfather looked like someone who could have many grandchildren, but not a wife or his own children. Okay, so the author again says that he could never imagine that once his grandmother was young and a pretty lady. He could not connect to this idea. He could not connect to this idea. He could not connect to this thought, and this thought was almost revolting, because he had always seen his grandmother as an old lady. He has always seen his grandmother old and full of wrinkles, right? The author says that his grandmother used to tell him and his cousins about her childhood memories. She used to tell them about the games she used to play in her childhood, and the author and his cousins found this story told by their grandmother very illogical and disrespectful. They did not believe that these stories were true. Why so? Why didn't they believe that the stories, the grandmother's own stories of life were not true? Why did they think that? Because they could not even imagine that their grandmother was once a child at a point of time. Once upon a time she was a child. That was hard to believe for them. and she used to play such games. Okay, so these things were very hard to believe for this little child, for the author. They thought that the stories she said about her own life, the stories of her own childhood, they thought that these stories of her life were like the other moral stories she used to tell them. They listened to the grandmother's own life stories just like they listened to the other moral stories told by the grandmother. Now, she had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her, old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older, and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. So now again the author describes his grandmother. Okay, so the author's grandmother was short, fat, and slightly bent in posture. She was slightly bent forward due to her old age weakness. Okay, her face had a lot of wrinkles, and the author says that she seemed so old as if it was impossible for her to grow old anymore. Okay, so and she had been the same old grandmother for the past 20 years. Now, she could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. So here the author says that his grandmother was beautiful. She was a beautiful woman, but she was never pretty, or she was never a very good looking kind of a lady. The author says that. Okay, the grandmother used to walk around the house in an awkward way, wearing spotless white clothes. She used to hold the beads of rosary which hanged from one hand, and the other hand she rested on her back for the support. So that's how she used to walk in the house. Okay, she had then again she had silver colored hair which were scattered untidily, means her hair was not neatly combed and was disorganized, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayers, means she was constantly and very silently chanting prayers. So she used to constantly and silently chant the prayers. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breeding peace and contentment. So here the author compares the grandmother to the winter landscape in the mountains, which has a peaceful and very calm feel. She was an example of pure white character and who used to spread peace everywhere. That is why the author says that she was just like the white mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, means she had a calm, relaxed, and very peaceful kind of a character or personality. Now, my grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. So now the author says that he lived with his grandmother in the village. Okay, his parents left him with her, with his grandmother, and his parents then went to settle in the city first. Okay, they went to live in the city first. They went to settle in the city. And they left the author with his grandmother in the village. So the author says that he and his grandmother became good friends. They were good friends. He said that the grandmother used to wake him up every morning and get him ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. So here the author says that the grandmother used to recite her morning prayers. She used to sing her morning prayers while she bathed. Okay, while she bathed, she used to recite and she used to sing the morning prayers while she bathed and dressed him up. And she used to recite the morning prayers when she bathed and when she dressed when she dressed up the author. Okay, and he also says that she used to sing those morning prayers and hoped that he would listen to the prayers and memorize them. But the author says that he never tried to memorize a word of what she spoke or whatever she recited. He used to listen to them. He used to listen to whatever the grandmother recited, whatever the grandmother sang. But he never tried to learn that. He loved her voice. He listened to them because he loved her voice, but he never tried to memorize a single word of what she spoke. He never tried to learn it. Now, then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny Arden ink pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. So here it is said that the grandmother, after getting the author ready for school, she used to make his things ready. And his things were a wooden slate, a tiny Arden ink pot, and a red pen. So she would arrange his things, she would make his things ready and give it to him. And then again, before going to school, the author used to have his breakfast along with his grandmother. He would eat a thick stale chapati with butter and sugar spread on it, and they both, means the author and the grandmother, used to walk to the school. And the grandmother used to carry stale chapatis with her for the village dogs, means she would carry the stale chapatis to feed the village dogs on their way to school. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. So here the author says that his grandmother used to go with him to the school. Now, why did she used to go with him to the school? Because the temple was attached to the school, and she was a religious kind of a woman, and she used to visit the temple daily. He says that on one side he would sit on the veranda with other children. He would sit on the veranda of the school with other children. He would sing the alphabet and prayers in the chorus. And at the same time, on the other hand, his grandmother would sit in the temple and read the scriptures. Now, when we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. And now the author says that after finishing reciting the prayers and alphabets in school, and after the grandmother finishes reading the scriptures, both of them would walk back home together. And this time, on their way back home, the village dogs met them at the temple door. Okay, and they, means these dogs, these village dogs, used to follow the author and the grandmother to their home. they used to follow them, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis that the author and the grandmother threw to them. So that's how the author and the grandmother were living their lives in the village. They were just like two very good friends. So, students, we will stop here for now and we'll continue the further chapter in the next session.